I will just very quickly review the last slide that we went over, because it's good to have this in your mind as we go forward to more particular real world examples. So if you remember, I made that distinction between illegitimate and illegal orders, and I quoted Luther from On Temporal Authority. And so illegitimate orders are orders that aren't necessarily immoral or ungodly, but it is someone giving an order outside of their jurisdiction. And then there's illegal orders, which are by definition illegitimate because you're giving an immoral, or as I'm calling it, an illegal order. But they are not just illegitimate in terms of outside of one's office, but also they command ungodliness or something immoral. So let's do some examples. So we've got a Canadian Mountie here, and we're here in Illinois, and let's say you're driving along, and this guy gallops up when you stop at the stoplight, and he pulls you over. I don't know how he would do this, but he pulls you over. What's your response? Yeah, what? Why are you on a horse? You know? Why are you making yeah, this isn't Chicago. Yeah. Why are you making whirring sounds with your mouth? No. So your response is undoubtedly, okay, but I'm not in Canada, right? It's not that you don't respect civil government. It's not that you don't respect the Canadian well, maybe you don't, but you know, it's not that you don't respect civil authority. It's just he's outside of his jurisdiction. You're not in Canada. He doesn't have legal authority or proper authority in this case. This is similar to the Leipzigers, like Luther saying the Leipzigers trying to impose things upon the Wittenbergers. It's still all in the civil authority realm, but you're outside of your particular jurisdiction. Let's do another example. Example 2, when an authority steps outside of his sphere into another estate. The Canadian Mountie is staying within the broad realm of civil authority, but now he's jumped jurisdictions. Now what about if someone goes out of his estate into someone else's? So there's a mayor. He's obsessed with the color purple, and he orders that everyone in your town must wear purple clothing every second Saturday of the month. I don't know who your mayor is in Mattoon, but let's say the mayor issued that decree. What are you going to say?
That's for LW Nelson.
That's for LW. Yeah. You're going to say, you don't get to tell me what I wear. That is beyond your scope of authority, and in fact, you're intruding in upon the home. So those were illegitimate orders. Let's look at an illegal order. When an authority steps beyond his office and outside of any office by commanding something wicked. The president of a bank tells you, his subordinate, to funnel money to a secret account for his and your own enrichment. What would you do? Now, is he an authority in your bank's authority structure? Yes. He's a legitimate authority. He's been duly promoted, elected, appointed, whatever, and he holds true authority in the bank. However, why would you resist? Why would you say no? Because what he is commanding is illegal and it's immoral. So this is similar to Luther's advice to soldiers who know that they're being ordered to fight in an unjust war. They acknowledge their overlord or their king or their commanding officer, but they understand that they are being ordered to do something illegal. This is very similar to Shiphrah and Puah. You remember the midwives of Egypt. Pharaoh orders them to do what? Murder the male Israelites. Murder the male Israelites when they're born. Now, some people might be tempted to think, yeah, but that's really clear. It's just murder. It's straight up against the fifth commandment. But imagine, because, I remember back in the early days of Ronatide, some people said, listen, if the government was clearly saying something and telling us to do something immoral, then we would resist. But it's not clear. because they say this is for medical necessity. They're not saying you can't preach the gospel. And so there's all these other reasons. I'm not an expert, and so I can't make a judgment call on this. Well, you can construct the same thing if you're the Pharaoh, honestly. We read that story and we say, hey, kids, in Sunday school, this is a clear call to murder. So obviously you say no. But what if you were those midwives and the Egyptian Pharaoh says, I understand your concerns. Under normal circumstances, I would never ask you to do this thing. But those Israelites, they're almost ready to outnumber us in our own land. This is a matter of national security. National security. We've got to do this. Murder's generally wrong, you're right, but this is an exception. And if I were to outwardly cut this problem out, we'd have a huge rebellion on our hands. So you aren't the expert for national affairs, are you? Do you have a political philosophy degree? Do you understand international politics? I mean, Babylon's getting stronger. You got the Nubians to the south. All of these things are going on. You're just a midwife. You don't know what's going on. No, as a midwife, you do know what's going on. You know that you don't murder babies. And so even if the order to murder is dressed up for all of these other reasons, and that it's even denied that this is murder, but for the sake of national security, you still say, no, I'm not going to do that because it's an illegal, immoral order. Let's think about another example. The narrative of and the account of Saul and David is a really excellent one that the reformers used and talked about. And we'll talk a little bit about it. But one underutilized biblical account is David and Abigail. If you remember, Nabal, the fool, allowed David's men to protect his flocks all throughout many months, maybe even years. And David comes for when they are going to harvest their fruits, right? They're going to have a big feast, and he expects, rightly so, that he will get to partake of the profit as he helped partook of the labor and the risk. And what happens? Well, I'll cut to the chase. Nabal says, who's he? I don't care. I'm not going to do this. Now, David is rightfully upset, and he even is planning on going and taking it out on Nabal. There's a very real possibility that Nabal's whole household is going to be wiped out because of this. Now, whether that's a proper response or almost response by David or not is besides our point. There is a clear and present danger for Nabal and his whole household to be wiped out. And so what does Abigail, the wife of Nabal, do? She takes it into her own hands in fear and trembling and goes around her husband and his authority to what? Make a peace offering, basically. Gathers up tons of supplies, rides them out to David, and begs that he not take vengeance for the sake of her foolish husband. So now in terms of exceptions and rules, what's the rule in the home? Who's the head? He is, absolutely. But does that mean she is to obey him when he's going to lead the whole household into very serious ruin? I mean, this doesn't give license for a wife to say, anytime I disagree with my husband, I'm going to do whatever I want because I think I know best. No, but here, the circumstances, the burden of proof is met that there's a clear and present danger, and that if she does nothing, what's going to happen? Not just she is probably going to get killed, but also, remember, Nabal's a very rich man. He has all these flocks. So his household is not just him and Abigail, but countless numbers of servants and their families and the herders and everyone who's in charge of the flocks. And so she, as the queen of the little clan, in fear and trembling, is saying, I have to disobey. I have to disobey under these circumstances because, of course, Nabal doesn't want her to do this. If she would have gone and said, hey, I'm going to go do this, what's he going to say? No, and prevent her. But in fear and trembling, she disobeys. Now, she doesn't resist him with armed force because it's not necessary in this situation, but she goes around his back. She subverts his will to save the community. And we all sit back and say, yeah, this was right. and forget that somehow, I'm not saying us in particular, but people look at this and undoubtedly they teach it as Abigail is the hero, as is very clearly demonstrated in the scriptures and implied. Then what happens? Romans 13, you have to obey no matter what. Oh, that's not what this teaches at all. In fact, she's rewarded by God. She becomes a queen. She becomes one of David's wives. Because Nabal, of course, is punished by God and he dies. So anyway, I think that's an underutilized text. Here's another example. When an authority steps beyond his office in a tyrannical or monstrous way, and this is not, this is, in really horrible ways. You imagine you are a slave, chattel slavery here. You're a slave. Your master, who is your superior, correct? He's your superior. Paul's very clear that you are to even obey harsh masters. Your master breaks into your house and attempts to not just give you a couple extra lashings or give you an extra duty in the middle of the night that you obey, even though you don't think it's fair or just. But no, he goes beyond that. He does something monstrous, tyrannical. He attempts to violently assault your wife or your children. And he orders you to step aside. You obey that order? No, unless you're a coward, unless you don't understand that you, even though you have everything in Christ, and not even this master can take the forgiveness of sins from you, that your office that God gave you is to lay down your life for your wife and your children. So again, there's another distinction at work here. There's a distinction between what 1 Peter 2 talks about, you even obey a harsh master, but there's a difference between a harsh master and a monstrous or tyrannical master who's going to commit notorious, atrocious crimes that are irremediable. They're irreparable. If he were to come and murder your child, can you appeal to the judge and have that undone? No, you can't. If your master is overly harsh and whips you a few extra times, I'm not saying that's good or right or just, but will you be able to go on with life? Yes. But if someone's going to take a life, that's a notorious injury. You can't take it back. It's irremediable by definition. And by thinking through these things, the reformers, as we'll get into in a moment, such as Luther, Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, Amsdorf, Brenz, on, came to make a distinction between rebellion, which they continued to speak against, and made a distinction between rebellion and the duty to resist, sometimes even with violence, when one was faced with a monstrous or tyrannical ruler. So a person has a duty to resist notorious or atrocious injury, which is attempted against himself or against those under his care. This is rooted in natural law and self-defense. A monster who seeks to overthrow the foundations must be stopped. So not just on the particular level, but especially on a grand scale. This would be leading us to talk about totalitarianism. And the reformers came to understand that this was in accordance with both natural law and positive law in many nations and histories and traditions. And it's in accordance with the offices into which God has placed a father, mother, ruler, etc. Other examples are Moses, Jael, Uriah, and Jehu, but we don't have time for that. Sometimes the objection is brought up where David spares Saul, and he does it twice, remember? Saul's chasing him around, and honestly, the reformers, many of them in their early careers, use this as an example to say you can never resist a tyrant or a monstrous ruler, even in cases of notorious injury, because David does not lay a hand on Saul. Now, you can disobey, but if you disobey, you got to suffer. That's where they started out. But they moved beyond that. And let's think about why. Well, let's think about that account or that narrative. If you actually stop and think about it, was David ever in a position where the choices were so stark as Saul is going to murder me or someone under my care, or I have to kill him? Was David ever actually in that situation? No. He wasn't actually. Now, was Saul seeking to commit murder against David? A notorious injury? Yes, absolutely. God preserved David from getting his back up against the wall, honestly. Because every time Saul gets close, what happens? David slips away. He slips away. He's never actually in the position where he is faced with having to kill the king or defend himself. I'm sorry, kill the king or be killed. God preserves him from that very, very difficult position. Melanchthon speaks about this in great depth in one of his works. And Melanchthon points out, that first of all, David was not wanting to start off his reign because he has a promise from God that he's going to be the king. I mean, how is it if you start off your reign killing the previous ruler? This is not the best way. Also, he makes the point that I just made, that God preserved him from actually having his back against the wall. When David finds Saul in the cave, he could have gotten him, right? But Saul doesn't know he's in the cave. If Saul would have realized that and pinned David and his men up against the back of the cave, then he's in a different position. It's significantly different. Okay, let's go to one last example for the moment. Jonathan's heroic feat and Saul's rash vow. The short version is Jonathan, he is, doing a special forces maneuver where he and his armor bearer go and rout the entire Philistine army. He fights some of them, and God grants him the victory, and they take off running. And so then Saul and the rest of the Israelite army realize this, and so they pursue them. And they are, this retreat is turning into a rout, and Saul makes this foolish vow of saying, anyone who puts anything past their lips, eats anything, shall be put to death. It's a very foolish and rash vow, but all the soldiers, whether it's foolish or not, he is the king, and so they obey him. But then Jonathan, who's not there when he gives the order, he dips his spear in some honey, and he takes some honey, and it brightens his eyes. And then later on, it comes to pass that Saul finds out that it is Jonathan who has done this. I'm summarizing, I know, but the point is that Jonathan is the one who has done this, and Saul is ready to kill him. Surely you shall die, says Saul. And guess who stands between the king, the commanding officer, and the father of Jonathan? Yeah, it's the men. It's the troops who will not allow this to happen. And here's the quote. As the Lord, shall Jonathan die who has worked this great salvation in Israel? They recognized that Jonathan was the one who brought them the victory through the strength of God. That was apparent to anyone who had a brain. Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So they determine that what Saul is about to do is a monstrous, tyrannical, absolutely immoral thing, and they say, no, it's not going to happen. So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. And all the reformers recognized that here there was the implicit threat that the soldiers would have stopped Saul if he tried to carry out this with violence if necessary. But Saul sees reason, or at least he's intimidated, and he backs off. So if you look at these biblical narratives, and these are narratives that the reformers used as well, there's a clear depiction of a time and a place to resist authority, sometimes even with force. Okay, now we're going to get into the history of Lutheran resistance theory. So early Luther and other reformers, so when folks who just want to ideologically or simplistically look at questions surrounding obedience to legitimate authorities, usually will take quotes from this period. And it's a very selective cherry picking. Luther said never resist. Luther just said disobey and suffer. Yeah, he said that in 1520 whatever. Have you looked at what he said later? There's this little game that people play about cherry picking quotes, particularly from the early Luther, on a whole host of topics without acknowledging where he wound up. Now, we don't have time to get into all of this, but I just want to throw out a few things, that there is continuity in the reformers' thoughts. Luther, Melanchthon, all these others, but there is also significant development. And from the very beginning, there is this spectrum of what it means to disobey. And I've been kind of dancing through these things without making this spectrum kind of explicit. So obviously there's disobedience. Someone tells you that you have to go worship Allah. Well, you just disobey it. You just don't do it. So if you want to call that just disobeying an order, fine. What about passive resistance? Well, there's a an understanding of passive resistance. Maybe you disobey, but you don't exactly either proclaim what you're not doing, or you passively resist and you drag your feet and you make it difficult for the other person. I know none of us remember this as children, right? There's different ways to disobey your parents, ranging from disobedience to more passive resistance. And then, of course, the strongest form of resistance, at least in a earthly, temporal sense, would be armed resistance. And I just want to make the point that the reformers never, ever, 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 ever had in their mind the question of, should we ever disobey or not? The real question was focused on, is there a time and a place to disobey, and actually engaged in armed resistance? They always all agreed that there was a time and a place to resist passively, to disobey, to drag their feet, and to preach against the authorities that were commanding them illegitimate or illegal things. So it was never true that they believed that you should just mindlessly obey orders. Total myth. No substance in the historical record. Example, even from the early days. Luther complained about the princes publishing the Edict of Worms. I mean, he complained about this. Why did you do this? You should have just refused to do it. This is wrong. And then, well, this kind of is a side note, but Fritz wanted to talk about reasonableness. Charles V, the emperor, who promulgated the Edict of Worms, and the Elector of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, they obviously were very close to each other. They didn't want to have a fight. And it goes to show you how far Charles V wanted to be reasonable. Later on, he was not so reasonable. But at the beginning, he wanted to be very reasonable and not have a direct confrontation with Frederick the Wise for the sake of peace, harmony, hopefully being able to work it out. Remember, it was years before the break was certainly and definitively, between the Roman side and the Lutheran side. And so there's lots of hopes. Maybe we'll have a general council. Maybe the ecclesiastical officials will come around. And so guess what? The Edict of Worms was purposefully never sent to Saxony directly. Why? Because if Charles V does that, what is he forcing the elector to do? To refuse to publish it. And so it's amazing how reasonable some of these guys were in understanding how to escalate and how to slowly escalate so that there would be a chance for peace and harmony and reasonableness to work out. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but that's a different story. A couple other things to talk about in terms of what shaped the reformers' early thought on this. The Peasants' War. That was an utter, rebellious, chaotic event. And it was so traumatic for the reformers and, for Germany as a whole that they were very, very hesitant to say anything that might contribute to another peasants' revolt. And that was one of the reasons why they were, again, so hesitant to even talk about legitimate armed resistance against tyrannical rulers. Okay, so let's look at what their early position was. First off, Luther was the most reticent to accept violent resistance or armed defense against legitimate authority. Obviously, Luther is our guy, and we read him with great honor and respect, but it should be noted, he was one of, if not the most reticent, to come around to the position that there is a time and a place for legitimate armed violent resistance or self-defense against superior authority. Melanchthon was very similar to Luther in this, and we'll see kind of how they come around. But I want to point out two interesting exceptions. Bugenhagen and Amsdorf actually are okay with the idea that there's a distinction between rebellion and self-defense or legitimate armed resistance rather early on. But why was Luther so reticent? Well, here's a couple of his arguments. I've already stated it, but no armed resistance. If you're going to disobey a legally or legitimate constituted civil authority, you just have to disobey and suffer. That's kind of his general advice during this early period. Why? Because no man can be his own judge. We should not judge our own cause and our own cases. And in general, that is true. Secondly, vengeance was to be undertaken by established civil authorities. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. And he pours out that vengeance through intermediate authorities, and that's legitimate. However, Luther believed that the individual or the non-legally established individual or person can't undertake that on his own behalf, or because A, he can't be his own judge, but also it's not his office to execute vengeance. Also, Luther was working under this domino theory of disobedience. He, again, had this great concern for chaos. The Peasants' War did not help this. And so he was very, very concerned about if obedience to the emperor falls down, what's going to happen? Well, people will stop obeying the emperor, then they'll stop obeying the princes, they'll stop obeying the local and regional authorities, and all authority will break down. I think Luther's right in his instincts, even though he hasn't gotten to the point where he acknowledges legitimate exceptions. But his instincts are good. What's worse, the tyrant or the mob? The mob is worse. Absolutely. I don't like tyranny. I don't want a tyrant. I don't want a monstrous ruler. But if we're going to err on the side of order or chaos, you want to err on the side of order, 8 days a week. So as I mentioned before, there was some early notable exceptions to this. What a good octon is an opinion. So the princes would often ask the theological faculty at Wittenberg their opinion on certain matters. So Frederick the Wise says to the faculty, I want your opinion on whether it's legitimate for me to resist the emperor. This is a burning question all through the time of the Reformation. Because, of course, the emperor is a good Roman Catholic. He's going to be a loyal ally of the Pope. And every so often, it seems like he's going to march up north and crush the Lutherans and the Lutheran princes. So he asks the faculty, is this ever permissible? Luther says no, Melanchthon says no, but then you have Bugenhagen and Amsdorf who actually say, yeah, maybe under certain circumstances you could. And here I think they reflect a kind of a common sense understanding of exceptions. But they're not the dominant voice in those early years. Luther, on temporal authority, he repeats the same thing, no armed resistance. If you're going to disobey, which sometimes is a Christian duty, then you just have to suffer. Even though not many people have noticed this or talked about it, but he has an interesting section in there on Samson, because he says no man can judge his own cause or take up his own cause and judge himself. But there is that time that Samson does it. So maybe theoretically it is possible. And then he just kind of skirts right on by. But you can tell there is this idea there. Then in 1526, when it seems like Charles V might come marching up north again on whether soldiers too can be saved, Luther recognizes one exception. A ruler could be deposed and resisted if he has gone mad. Because, of course, if he's gone mad, if he's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, then you know that you gotta stop him, or else he's just going to cause widespread destruction. Bugenhagen in 1529 again presents a positive view on resistance, but notably asks the princes, or the prince, to keep his opinion secret so that his colleagues could think about it further. Because again, he wants to be reasonable. He wants the Wittenberg circle to be united and come around together on this. There's a huge turning point in 1530/1531. This is all the events surrounding the Great Diet of Augsburg, when Charles V calls everybody together, all the princes, all the town councils, to talk about two things. What are we going to do about all of the religious tumult of the Reformation? And that, of course, results in the presentation of the Augsburg Confession. Praise be to God. But also, it's what are we going to do about the Turks? The Turks are coming up. They're banging on the gates of Vienna. How are we going to stop them? Well, all of this question about the armed resistance to the emperor gets brought up again because he may have a free hand to deal with the Lutherans in those subsequent years. So let's look at it from each point of view. The princes, especially Philip of Hesse and John the Steadfast of Saxony, Frederick has died, John the Steadfast has taken over. They obviously believe, you can read this through their correspondence and also by the questions they ask the theologians, they believe that they have a duty to defend others under their care. And I think this comes from their paternal heart. Common sense. I'm the father of my people. If the emperor comes up here and tries to deprive us of the true faith and also brings a bunch of troops, that's going to be bad for my people. Shouldn't I defend them? Well, they get some huge help from the jurists. I don't mean like trial lawyers, but jurists who have studied Roman and medieval law. And the jurists play a very decisive role in eventually changing the opinions of the reformers from their earlier position of, well, if you disobey, yeah, sometimes you got to disobey, but then you got to suffer. You can't resist the civil authority by force. Well, the jurists, particularly the Saxon and Hessian jurists, argue for the right or duty to resist on legal grounds. Now, this is a very complex story. I am summarizing it. If you want some of the sources, I'd be happy to talk to you after the presentation. But there's two main grounds. Number one, constitutionalist grounds. The Holy Roman Empire, in some ways, was similar to the early American Republic, where it wasn't a unitary state, or a dynastic monarchy. So Charles V, it wasn't automatic that his son would become emperor after him, but they had what was called 7 electors, the most powerful princes or rulers, let's leave it like that, who would elect the next emperor. And so this wasn't a straight top-down monarchy, but actually, it was kind of a mixed system, not mixed in the sense of representative and monarchy, but these constitutionalist grounds were that in the Holy Roman Empire, the electors are not merely subjects, but they're also rulers because they placed the emperor into power. So this was an argument based on positive law and the particular circumstances of the empire. More importantly, in my opinion, was their argument based on natural law. So the natural law grounds of self-defense and the immediacy or irremediable nature of notorious and atrocious injuries, which I talked about a little while ago. So they had lots of precedents from the ancient and medieval laws, such as feudal defiance. That's when a feudal vassal would even go against his lord under certain circumstances. This was recognized in medieval law. Reprisals, like letters of marque and reprisal. So yeah, that's very complicated, but let's not get into that. Notorious injury I brought up already. And also they look to examples of canon law. Judges who act outside of their jurisdiction may be rebuffed. Judges who impeded justice or who interfered with appeals. And this was very important for the Lutherans because what was their refrain when they were trying to reform the church? Let's talk this over. Let's actually have a general council. And so Charles V told the princes at one point, well, until there's a general council, you guys take care of the religion in your zones, in your provinces. And now he's taking that away, but it's before what's been heard, the appeal. And so there's huge precedent that judges who interfere with appeals are not to be obeyed, but rather to be resisted. Also, the jurists pointed out to the theologians on behalf of the princes that the theologians were being a little bit too doctrinaire and too general about another matter. And that was that it was a well-established legal principle that one could be his own judge in cases of notorious injury. Again, if someone breaks into your house and is about to assault or murder one of the persons under your care, do you have time to say, let me go see if this is legal or not? Let me go. When there's only minutes, how does that go? When there's only seconds, who's minutes away? The police sometimes, right? Yeah. You don't have time to appeal to the normal constituted authority. You have to judge that case. There's a guy with a knife out lunging at my child. There's no time. You have to judge that situation and blow him away if you care about him, right? And so you can be your own judge in certain cases. And so they appealed to Roman law that even a consul, one of the highest officials in Rome, if a consul was caught coming and assaulting a family member and you come home and find this, guess what you could do under Roman law? You could kill him with impunity. Obviously that you proved this was the situation because it's a notorious injury. You don't have time to take it to the officials. Also, they talked about private resistance based on self-defense, which we've been talking about as well. And also that a prerequisite to such self-help was the absence or denial of justice by the legally constituted authorities. So again, Charles V was not actually allowing their appeal to go to the proper authorities. And another key point was that the emperor, in going after them for preaching the gospel, was acting outside of his jurisdiction. And thus he was acting not as an office holder, but actually as a private person. And a private person can and should be resisted if they are committing a crime, especially a notorious or atrocious one. So that plays on the distinction between person and office. How did the theologians respond to this? Well, in 1530 and 1531, there's a lot of changing dynamics. And they basically come to the point where they say, we don't agree with everything you jurists are saying yet, but maybe on legal grounds, these constitutionalist grounds, resistance is permissible. But that's a matter for the jurists, they say. So they kick it back to the experts, right? The theologians weren't ready to positively support it based on natural law yet. And Luther was still incredibly reticent and wouldn't hardly approve of resistance. And you can see this in letters, specifically to Lazarus Spengler and Wenceslas Link. This, however, is not the end of the story. Even to this day, there's a lot of people who think this is as far as Luther and the other reformers go. They say maybe there's this constitutional ground, but they really haven't changed their basic theological position. But that's not the end of the story. But before we get to the end of the story, I just want to mention the Torgau Declaration. They recognize, the theologians recognize the possibility of armed resistance based upon that positive law, that constitutionalist argument. And then also Luther writes his warning to his dear German people. And there's lots of stuff in there that shows that he is changing. Distinctions and integration. I don't want to go too far into depth on this. I just want to make this point, that 1530 is a huge turning point for the reformers on a whole host of matters, from emphasizing distinctions to greater attention to connections and the proper relationship. So that's why I entitled this slide Distinctions and Integration. In some ways, it's easier to say these are the differences. And then it's trickier to be able to bring those distinctions back and say, how do they actually interrelate? How do you integrate that in? Think about common distinctions that we make. Law, gospel, right? And then there's people who very foolishly start highlighting the Bible. That's a law verse, that's a gospel verse, right? And they don't understand how the two things are integrated. Justification, sanctification, and never the twain shall meet. No, there is a distinction that we must preserve, but there's also a relationship there. Well, especially on church and state questions, two kingdom, three estates questions, From 1530 on, there is a decided shift in how now they need to integrate the reality of the Christian inhabiting particular offices with his spiritual life in Christ. How do you give advice to the person who's both a Christ person, a Christian who has everything, but also who's a Welt person, someone who has earthly duties, so that they can offer by the end a very inclusive vision of the Christian life with earthly duties. Okay, let's look at where they wind up. So from the mid-1530s through the 1540s, the reformers wind up totally adopting all the jurists' points. So it's hilarious to read them, especially writing to their buddies who say, "Are you changing your mind?" And Luther's like, no, I'm not changing my mind. I've never changed on resistance at all. And then, of course, he's adopting all. He's not like lying to them, but he doesn't understand the development that's happening, even in his own mind, and how he's sliding into this position. And that takes several years, and we don't have time to go through the whole story, but where they wind up is that they wind up taking on all of what I laid out, what the jurists were pointing out. And this kind of makes sense, because the jurists are the experts. And while now they need to take the jurists' points about civil life and legal traditions and exceptions to the rule and the ancient and natural law understanding of self-defense, now they take those exceptions in and they make them their own so that they can preach about it and give good pastoral, what's the word you like, Fritz? Counsel, right? Can I say that? Okay, I'll use it anyway. So there's a couple Gutachten, a couple theological opinions that most people don't know anything about, unfortunately, that specifically speak to armed resistance. One of the principles at work where they flat out say, yes, there's a time and a place to resist even a properly constituted overlord. This is the principle at work. The gospel does not abolish politics or political laws. So that's an important principle. And also that the princes have a duty to protect the church and the true religion, linked with the duty to resist. So because they are protecting the true faith, and because they've been given proper authority, they're accountable to God to watch over and protect the church as well. So rulers are commanded to preserve God's name from being dishonored. Now, this is a quote. Therefore, the princes are bound to plant and uphold true doctrine in their territories, and as God threatens those who dishonor his name, so also will he help those who abolish idolatry and protect pious Christians. So there, and guess who signs that? Luther and Melanchthon and Jonas and Buggenau, all these guys. They sign saying, yes, there's a time and a place to use armed resistance against wicked authorities. Also, Luther has a disputation on the three hierarchies. That is supposed to have come out last summer in the American edition, so translated into English, but they pushed it back. Hopefully this summer we'll get it. Luther adds a third angle to all of this, saying, sure, the emperor says he's coming up as our civil lord, but really, who is he in fact and in truth? He's nothing but the soldier of the Pope. And he is doing the Pope's bidding. He's not doing this emperor as emperor, but he's trying to command and rule over us as a servant and as an agent of our enemy, the Antichrist, the Pope himself. I think this is rather an important point because, the emperor wouldn't say that that's what he's doing. He would say, and he tried to say, well, this is purely a civil matter. You heard that one before? This has nothing to do with religious stuff. It reminds me of during Ronatide when governments crushed church services, but they never said it's because you can't worship or believe or whatnot as you wish. This has nothing to do with religion. This is for safety concerns. And yet the hypocrisy and the lie was always apparent because they would crush, churches while Walmart had thousands of people passing through their doors each and every day. If it was really about safety, then this makes no sense. And that's what Luther was saying. This was really just about civil stuff. No. You're a soldier of the Pope. This was tightly linked with the idea of the beer wolf or the bear wolf. In English, we would use this term like the werewolf. Not just a wolf, but a monstrous being who seeks to overthrow, in Luther's language, overthrow the foundations and attack God himself. A monster who seeks to overthrow the foundations. Even heads of households in Luther's disputation are called upon to fight against the Antichrist when God's order is threatened to be overthrown according to their station. And that would be, underneath their lesser magistrate. Luther also writes a letter in 1539 supporting resistance that points positively to the Maccabees, if you know that story, that account, and claims that the princes of Germany have more of a right to resist with arms the emperor than the people had against Saul or Joachim had against Jehoiakim. You can look that one up. We don't have time to go into it now. But his point is that if anybody had a right to resist, it's the German princes right now. It's super clear. The understanding of the three hierarchies preserves order, but it also limits power. So he's willing to say, yes, the fathers of the nation indeed are to be respected and honored as masters, as rulers, whom God is the ultimate source of authority. Yet at the same time, it limits their power by definition, because they, even though they may be authorities, they're still under God. Okay, so we've got a few more slides in this section. Hopefully we can get through it. I'm going to skip over this. I'm just going to make a note, von der Notwehrunterricht, instruction concerning self-defense. It's kind of interesting that Melanchthon here, in his most important work on the topic, doesn't actually call it resistance, but calls it defense or self-defense. He has a lot of good stuff in here that we've kind of covered already. Lots of interesting examples, notably not just from the scriptures, but also Christian history and quote-unquote secular history, like William Tell, the house fathers of Rhodes, Uriah. He even goes so far as to say, if Uriah would have caught David with Bathsheba, what could he have done? Killed him. Yeah. So Melanchthon has come full circle too. I'm sorry we don't have as much time to get into that. But anyway, but he also emphasizes the three estates. He doesn't talk about them per se, but the point is still there that each according to his station and each person in each situation is accountable to God. So each according to his station. This is an interesting side note. One of the examples, and this, I've got a Brenz quote. I can't track down who came up with it first, but they saw Pilate as a type of lesser magistrate. Because remember what Jesus says to him, right? You remember what he says? You would have no power over me were it not given to you from above. Who's the above? Who's he talking to? Or talking about? God. Yeah, well, yeah, his heavenly Father, but God himself. But according to the people who just believe in kind of this domino theory of authority, where does Pilate get his power from? Caesar. But Jesus, with his actual literal words, is making the point that even though, in terms of how is the power mediated, that Pilate got his authority from Caesar. Yes, that's true, right? But ultimately, who's he responsible to? God, each and every official. It's not enough to just say, hey, well, these were my orders. I'm sorry. If it were up to me, I'd do something else. How many people said that during Ronatide, right? I'm just obeying orders, just doing what I was told. No, Pilate, by Jesus' own words, is actually held accountable because he is accountable to God. Let's get to the Magdeburg Confession. So the Lutherans keep on thinking about this, and they have to think about this more. I'm just going to very briefly throw a few things out, because after Luther dies, Charles V finally does march up north and crushes the Schmalkaldic League in the Schmalkaldic War at the tragedy at, Mühlberg. And the Lutherans are totally defeated, and the Pope, at the, behest of the Pope, the Emperor, definitely at the behest of his Catholic advisors, and the Pope is lurking behind this too, even though he wants it even more stringent, sets up what's called an interim, trying to force the Lutherans back into the old medieval Roman faith. And they resist. And the kind of the great example and kind of the flowering of their understanding of resistance comes out in the Magdeburg Confession. Even though I would say Melanchthon's work that I mentioned earlier is just as important in some ways. Anyway, okay, so the Magdeburg Confession. This is translated into English. I would encourage anyone and everyone to have a copy. This is not a super long theological treatise. I think laymen should have a copy of the Magdeburg Confession too. It's a slim little volume, and it's only like 13 or 14 bucks on Amazon. It was just translated in, I think, 2012. Anyway, they come up with 4 main arguments of why the city of Magdeburg was resisting the emperor with arms. They were the last holdouts. First argument, from definition, I'm just going to quote them. The magistrate is an ordinance of God for honor and to good works, and a terror to evil works. Romans 13. Therefore, when he begins to be a terror to good works and honor to evil, there is no longer in him, because he does thus the ordinance of God, but the ordinance of the devil. Again, stepping out of his office. And he who resists such works does not resist the ordinance of God, but the ordinance of the devil. But he who resists, it is necessary that he resist in his own station as a matter of his calling. So not just any old person says, hey, you know what? I think the government is bad news and being totally tyrannical, so I'm going to start a rebellion. That is not what they're saying. But what they are saying is those to whom it has been given the care over a local community that's threatened by a tyrannical lord like Charles V, they should lead their people to resist. They also talk about when the magistrate is doing something wicked and different levels. The first level is an imperfect or a harsh ruler. We talked about this distinction already, the distinction between a harsh ruler and a monstrous or tyrannical ruler. And a harsh ruler, we should try to suffer along with. If we could just say, well, we can get rid of authority anytime we want, or if anyone is imperfect, well, then no one could ever hold any authority ever because we're all imperfect. So let's move to the second level, a tyrant who commits atrocious or notorious injuries. We've talked about this already. These are people where you can be your own judge in this situation, and you can resist them, even though the Magdeburgers are very reasonable and very sober and tell people, hey, we don't want to turn into a bunch of rebels here. So you don't always have to. You can seek a more peaceful solution, but you do have the right to resist because it is a notorious, atrocious injury. The third level would be like Schiffer and Pua, a tyrant who forces inferiors to certain sins, typically involving notorious and atrocious injuries. So it's the same as level 2, only not only is the tyrannical lord committing these crimes, but also he's forcing you to partake of it. There again, you can resist even with arms. However, if you can work it out, maybe that would be better. That's a matter of casuistry. Then the fourth level, the monstrous tyrant who seeks to persecute God himself and overthrow the foundations, deliberately and persistently seeking to, quote, destroy good works for all posterity. This is a very devil himself. He desires the extinction of the whole chain of knowledge of laws and divine promises, who wants to overthrow the foundations. That's the one everybody has to resist because they're trying to wipe out all good things. They're attacking God himself. The second argument is the necessarily inferred negative. Now that's a fancy term, right? But here's an easy way to understand it. We all know the quote, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. Well, if you say render everything to Caesar, that which is Caesar's, by saying there are some things that are to be rendered, honor, obedience, whatever, to Caesar, well, if some things are Caesar's, guess what else is true? Some things aren't. Some things aren't Caesar's. So not everything is Caesar's, which is to say not everything is the civil government's. And so Jesus' own words actually push us to see that we should not render everything unto Caesar, because there's the distinction made. Render to Caesar what's Caesar, but to God what is God's. And there's a lot of stuff out there that isn't Caesar's, and therefore we shouldn't render it to him. The third argument, and this is my favorite. Broughton and I have talked about this before. We actually had a podcast on Lutheran resistance, and if you want to hear more about that, we drill down into the details a lot more. But this is my favorite argument. How many impious and absurd things would follow if resistance was absolutely forbidden? I mean, that's the way to pop that bubble, right? So you're saying there's never a time and a place to engage in self-defense? You're saying there's never a time and a place for armed resistance? That means a father would have to watch his children get butchered. That means that a local magistrate would have to allow his overlord to come in, rape, pillage, murder, and destroy. And I can't do anything, sorry. I mean, that's insane. That's ridiculous. What if someone came in and said, we are going to violently try to wipe out Lutheranism in this land and kill all of you, right? Oh, sorry, we can't resist. Romans 13 tells me so. No, that's insane. It's not even a serious argument. Narratives that the Magdeburgers use, biblical examples, historical examples, they confirm and illustrate these seats of doctrine. Render unto Caesar, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2. And again, the protection of the church and defense of the true faith are linked together. Okay, is it time? It is time. Okay, we'll stop there.